My name is Victoria Tice. I'm a senior public health practitioner in Public Health Wales within the Primary Care Division, and I'm working on the Health Inequalities and Inclusion Health agenda. Inclusion health can include any person at greater or multiple risk of health inequalities, including but not limited to individuals experiencing homelessness, sex workers, or asylum seekers and refugees. These groups are more likely to experience stigmatization, social exclusion, discrimination, and severe and multiple disadvantage. Refugees and asylum seekers face extreme health inequalities. These are exacerbated by numerous factors, including forced displacement, poverty, social isolation, racism, violence, and the asylum policies and processes of host countries. Despite increased need to primary healthcare, this group faced increased and unfair challenges and barriers to accessing care when needed. And that can include language or communication difficulties, cultural barriers, a lack of awareness of the NHS, as well as a fear or stigma of discrimination relating to immigration status. So, what can and should the primary care system in Wales and those working with refugee, asylum seekers, or other migrants be doing to tackle these issues? Today's webinar will explore how primary care services in Wales can support and enable individuals seeking refuge or asylum to receive healthcare, providing an overview of the health needs and barriers faced and showcasing services and initiatives which support refugees and asylum seekers to access timely and equitable healthcare. Our presenters today are Dr. Ceiswyr Lloches, a GP in the Cardiff and Vale Inclusion Health Service, also known as CAVIS, Marina Davidson, a primary care advocacy manager from Doctors of the World, and Maria Doyle, a lead nurse for the Asylum Health Access Team in Swansea Bay. So just to start is a bit of housekeeping. The webinar is recorded, so the slides and the recording will be available on our primary care website after this session. After the presentations, there'll be a chance for you to ask questions. Isla sadly has to leave after hers, so we will have a quick Q&A with Isla. But if you think of anything after, if you pop it in the chat, we'll make sure that we connect you. And if you have any challenges or you experience any technology issues, just let us know in the chat and one of the team behind the scenes will help. So I'm just going to hand over to Isla. And let's crack on. But just to say, actually, if everyone can keep themselves muted and screens off, and then pop yourself off mute or put your hand up. And Isla, I'll wave when we've got 5 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you ever so much.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Vic, can you give me a thumbs up if you can?
Yeah, I can hear you.
All good, fine. Thank you very much. Great. All right, so thank you for having me. My name's Ceiswyr Lloches. I'm the Clinical Director and GP for Cardiff and Vale Health Inclusion Service. Thank you, Holly. Thank you, Holly, for doing the slides. Okay, so what I thought I'd start with is a bit of context around those seeking asylum and refugees, talk to you a little bit about what CAVIS provides as a service, a bit about barriers to accessing care, and then a case study. So I know there'll be people on this call who've got more experience than me at working closely with asylum seekers and refugees, and there'll be people who are just interested. So I've tried to pitch this somewhere in the middle. Thanks, Holly. Okay, so I think many of you will know what the difference is between a refugee and asylum seeker, but actually I think some people won't. And so I've put this up because before I started working closely with this group, I didn't actually know what the difference between a refugee and asylum seeker was. And actually the difference is vast and the vulnerabilities are quite different as well. So for asylum seekers, just to briefly explain, it's a person who is seeking protection under international law and is awaiting a decision on that claim. So if their claim is successful to the UK Home Office, they would be granted refugee status. And so a refugee then is a person who has sought that protection and has been granted that protection, and that will be for well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons such as race or religion, nationality, membership of a particular group, or political affiliation. So that's the difference. And in terms of the rights to housing, rights to benefits, support networks, the two groups are quite different. Thanks, Holly. So just a bit of data from the UNHCR. This is quite stark, really. So globally, this is data from June 2024. Globally, there are more than 117 million people who are forcibly displaced worldwide. 68 million of those are internally displaced within their own countries. 37 million are refugees and 6.9 million are asylum seekers. That's a huge amount of people. This is a real global issue. Thanks, Holly. A bit more data from UNHCR. So I think contrary to popular belief and what we might read in the press, actually 39% of refugees are hosted in 5 countries. The UK isn't one of those. So globally, that would be Turkey, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Colombia, Germany, and Pakistan. So those are the countries, the top countries that host the most refugees. 73% originate from 5 countries. Again, when I was reading about this was quite a surprise to me. So Afghanistan, again, not a surprise, and Syria, not a surprise, but Venezuela was a bit of a surprise to me. We don't see so many asylum seekers and refugees in our CAVIS service from Latin America. We see some, but not lots. Ukraine, and not a surprise, and South Sudan. 47 million are children and 2 million are born as refugees. And we know that 75% are hosted in low and middle income countries, which struggle often to have the infrastructure to cater for their own populations. So, as I said earlier, it's a real global issue. Thanks, Holly. So factors impacting health. I split this into 3. So the experiences of individuals in their home countries before they make their journeys, things that happen to kick off that journey or on the journey, and then factors affecting their health once they've arrived in the UK. So many people we see obviously have awful experiences in their home countries, which force them to need to leave. So, but in terms of their health experiences, often they've lived through poverty and malnutrition. There have been minimal health systems for them to access. Health literacy might be low, vaccination rates are low, infectious disease prevalence might be high, and there's often sort of a non-management or underdiagnosis of chronic disease. So when they come, they bring all those experiences with them, and actually integrating them into how the NHS works is complicated, isn't it? Even for people that are used to the NHS, it can be a bit opaque, some of the systems. So actually for individuals that are arriving who are in a vulnerable state, it's even more difficult. So that's home experiences. Things that happen on the journey or that have kicked off their need to travel would be things like war, facing violence, sexual violence, imprisonment for, as I've previously mentioned, for political beliefs, sexual orientation, alliances with various groups. Natural disaster is a big one, and sort of general threat. So those are the main events that might force someone to leave. Things that they experience on their journey will range from untreated injuries, sexually transmitted infections, unexpected or unintended pregnancies, the interruption of healthcare. So we have had people who have made that journey whilst previously undergoing treatment for cancer or chemotherapy, and so interruption of that. And also there's a lot of mental health and acute stress and trauma, and often things that people experience on their journeys can make that a lot worse. Thanks, Holly. So on to experiences in the UK asylum system. So I think once people arrive, it's often not the utopia that can be expected. I think there's loneliness, there's isolation, and sometimes people face hostility and discrimination from different communities. They're dealing with often the mental and physical effect of their journey and pre-journey events. Their asylum claim can often take priority over their health. So when they're given multiple health appointments, actually, if they've got appointments with solicitors or other services to help with accommodation or other essential items, then those would take priority, understandably. I think they face diseases of poverty. They have barriers to accessing healthcare, including language barriers, cultural barriers. Poverty also is a big barrier with the cost of transport to various appointments. And as I've mentioned, interruption in healthcare. So that's kind of what they're facing on arrival. In terms of the context that they live in on arrival, I think the £5.84 a day might be slightly out of date. It might be a little bit higher now with inflation, but not much higher. So these individuals live below the poverty line, and we all know the cost of living and the rising prices of everything. At the moment, actually living day to day is extremely difficult for many people. They're not allowed to work. The housing that's provided by the Home Office is temporary and is of varying quality. There's an even distribution of individuals throughout the UK who are in home office initial accommodation, which can be difficult for individuals who may know other people, have friends or relatives who might actually be being processed in other places in the UK. So often they get that separation, which is distressing. Some people are held in detention as well on arrival, and being held in detention has been shown to be an independent risk factor for psychological trauma. So I think that's an extremely difficult experience to go through detention. Many of those that we see here in Cafis have been through that experience. And in Wales, the healthcare entitlements are actually the same as the local population, which makes it privileged to work in Wales. So thanks, Holly. So this is just a photograph from a trip that I took to Calais with some colleagues a while back to try and deliver first aid and a bit of healthcare to those who are camping in non-formal campsites, waiting to try and make the trip, or some of them actually are just static there at the moment. So as you can see from the bottom left, it's a disused rail track, and these are the tents that a lot of these individuals are trying to live in at the moment. And I think what you see, a lot of these individuals are actually teenage boys and very, very young men who are vulnerable. There are families, and but they were on a different site. This picture is just the single people, mainly young men. Picture on the right is dressing wounds. So a lot of the conditions that we saw were around skin infestations and breakdown of skin, ulceration, infections. So there was a lot of sort of skin issues that we were trying to deal with. Thanks, Holly. So that's a bit of the context. I just wanted to talk to you briefly about what the Cafis service provides. Thanks. So this is our entrance. We're very proud of our big wall sticker, which is trying to just provide that warm welcome to people who may have never set foot in a health setting ever before. Thanks, Holly. So what do we do in Cafis? We provide evidence-based health and public health screening for people who have arrived newly seeking asylum, people who are under Home Office refugee resettlement programmes, or people that are survivors of trafficking, or anyone basically who's destitute, who's been living under the radar and then pops up, who might be no recourse to public funds. So they can come to our service and we'll assess them and give them the care that they need. So as well as doing the health screening and public health screening, we also deliver a sort of a limited primary care service whilst individuals are under Section 98 of the Immigration and Asylum Act. When they've had their Home Office interview and it's been deemed that the Home Office will support them through their asylum claim, we try and help register them with local practices to varying degrees of success. We also provide limited urgent primary care for multiply excluded homeless individuals. So that's where a GP and a nurse goes out to one of the high needs hostels in Cardiff every morning of the week to do drop-in clinics. We have an alternative treatment scheme for people who are banned from normal practices for violence and aggression, and we do that every Thursday with a security team. And then in spring, so hopefully after April in the new financial year, we are planning to start our outreach into sex parlours, probation services, and to mobile Roma and Gypsy unauthorised encampments. So that's just a brief overview of our service. Thanks, Holly. So just some numbers for you. With our refugee and asylum seeker cohorts, we've had 4 main cohorts over the last few years. So we've had those, so top left, those ready homes, we call them our ready homes cohort. So those that are arriving via irregular routes, so over the channel in small boats or in the backs of lorries generally, and they tend to be the most vulnerable of all our populations. We've then taken on care for a large cohort of Afghan refugees via the ARAP or ARCS scheme. We've been involved in screening for the Ukrainian sponsorship resettlement schemes. And then now we're in the middle of serving those Afghan entitled persons who the UK MOD are bringing over to rehouse. So we've got lots of different cohorts, just to make the point that actually, whilst the refugee resettlement cohorts go up and down depending on sort of acute global events, our ready homes irregular routes numbers stay fairly constant. Common languages, so top right, those are all the languages that we see coming through the service. So we use iPad translators, which has transformed our clinics. We used to use telephone actually, and these iPads where you can see a translator face to face have been brilliant. Some people choose not to use them, they prefer the voice, and that's fine, but it's nice to be able to give people the choice. Thank you. So just very quickly, I'll take you through like a bit of a process map about how an individual would move through our service. So top left, We get a list from the Home Office of all new arrivals into Cardiff. So Cardiff is one of the Home Office initial assessment centres in the UK. We have access to a list of everyone who's newly arrived and the language that they speak. We will then send them a letter inviting them for health screening to our service, and we'll send that letter in their own language to increase the chances of them attending. If they don't attend, we'll send them a follow-up letter in their own language. So we do proactively try and chase people down. We give them an introductory pack. So when they attend the clinic, we give them an introductory pack with a letter explaining that our service is nothing to do with the Home Office. It's confidential. We're here just to talk about their health and help them in that way. And we also will generate the NHS number for them at that point. They then get given an hour's appointment with a nurse who goes through a comprehensive health screening assessment. So a full history, birth history, travel history, vaccination history, everything that you can think of health-wise. And that's done by the translator. They'll also at that point get some screening, which I'll go through very briefly a bit later. Mental health screening. They'll have access to any vaccinations they need or catch-up vaccinations, accelerated Hep B courses, and then they get the offer of third sector support. So at the bottom of that box, down towards the bottom left of the diagram, if they need third sector support, we refer them to British Red Cross. So we commission British Red Cross to be in our department full time to provide that holistic support. So we found that a lot of people previously were presenting to the GPs for emergency appointments with problems with Aspen cards, problems with not having appropriate clothing, or issues with solicitors, and we as GPs and nurses didn't know how to deal with those things. So now we've got British Red Cross who are excellent at providing that service. And what's great about that service is that everybody that's working in the British Red Cross in our department has lived experience of the UK asylum system and speaks many different languages. So actually, for someone to come new to meet someone who speaks their language, who has also been through that experience, is really, really reassuring. And we often find actually that our service users disclose a lot more to our Red Cross colleagues than they do to us initially. So we have quite a sort of a completed circle of referral. So British Red Cross will refer back to us and say, actually, they may have disclosed this or this, and then we can take that forward. So it's a good sort of build-up of trust there we've got. Back to the top, if all the screening is normal and nothing else is needed, then we would help that individual register with a GP practice. If the person is particularly vulnerable and we think they won't make it in traditional services, we would keep them for an extended period of time to make sure they don't fall through the gaps. So after the screening, if there's any health concerns, that person is then booked in with a GP who will assess that and make any referrals that are needed. And again, when it's appropriate, that person will then be discharged from our service. Sometimes people are moved by the Home Office before we get to complete their care or discharge them in a satisfactory way. So we do endeavour to do a discharge summary for everyone that has been through our service, upload that to the Welsh Clinical Portal so that wherever they register then, be that anywhere in Wales, the clinicians that they come into contact with there can access what screening they've had. Thanks, Holly. So very briefly, this is our screening protocol. We've got one for adults and children. This is for children. So this is screening for asymptomatic children. We try and we've adopted a blanket albendazole approach. So anyone coming through, because of the prevalence of parasitic infection in stool and because of the difficulties in diagnosing parasitic infection in school, the evidence show that actually it's pragmatic and effective to blanket treat. So we give everyone over the age of 2 albendazole if there's consent there from the parents. We do blood tests for all. So we see a lot of nutritional deficiencies. So we'd be looking for anemia, iron deficiency, vitamin D deficiency. We screen everybody for hemoglobinopathies, and we'll do them, LFTs and USNEs as well. We do the BBV screening for children, and on top of that, we screen for strongyloides and schistosomiasis and Chagas disease as well if they're from Latin America. And we do come back with a fair amount of positives, so it's generally very evidence-based and worth doing. With regards to TB screening, you've got obviously your active TB screening with all your questions and picking up red flag symptoms. But for asymptomatic screening, we do MAN2 testing for all those who are under the age of 2, and then IGRA or quantiferon testing from serology for those that are over 2 years old. Anyone who is from a country which has a high incidence of multi-drug resistant TB, we would do a chest x-ray. We then go on, we'll check stools for ovocystis and parasites, although the pickup rate, even if you've got an infection, isn't great. Heights and weights, and we also review immunisations for all. So the adult one is fairly similar, so I haven't put that on as well. I mean, the differences with adult screening, this box on the right, we don't screen for vitamin D with adults. We would only test if people are symptomatic. We don't do twos for adults, and we offer urine STI screening as routine, and we don't give blanket albendazole for adults. So it's just a few differences. We have a paediatric nurse that does all our child screening, and adult nurses do the adults. Thanks, Holly. Okay, so very briefly, conditions seen, as I said, a lot of iron deficiency anemia, loads of hemoglobinopathies. I think I could probably count on two hands the number of people who do not have vitamin D deficiency that we've screened. Plenty of parasitic infection. As I said, obviously screened for BBV, and we get a fairly good number that we can treat and refer into our ID colleagues. We don't screen for H. pylori, but actually if people are present with symptoms, we do test and we get a lot of positive results there. We see a lot of latent TB, a lot of dental decay, and loads of undiagnosed or unmanaged chronic disease, chronic conditions, lots of trauma, stress and PTSD, anxiety and depression, and a fair amount of safeguarding issues. So I'd say that there is our main the main conditions we see. So barriers, I'll whip through this very quickly because I think another colleague after me is going to talk about this. So barriers in registering with GPs, I think we probably all know this. Language is a huge one. So language and literacy with actually filling in the form is very, very difficult. And often GP practices don't offer that support at reception to be able to do that. Sometimes registrations are done in a very narrow and specific time window, again, with minimal assistance. Some people are asked to register online, but with IT poverty, people not having access to smartphones necessarily or Wi-Fi, that's difficult to do. Some practices historically have asked for ID to be able to register a patient, which is actually against the contract. You don't need ID to register. You could register as an alias if you want. So that's not a reason to refuse. Some practices have historically declined to register asylum seekers or travellers. Now, I think that is not because people are intentionally being difficult. I think sometimes colleagues are unaware of the law and the fact that healthcare is available to all in Wales. I think it's just a lack of awareness and education rather than anything more sinister, but that is changing. So the more we've are liaising with our primary care colleagues in GMS practices, we don't see that as much of an issue anymore. Other issues are the nomadic nature of lots of these individuals. So those who are in fixed home office accommodation get to register with a local GP, but there's many that we have, particularly in Cardiff, who are no recourse to public funds, who are sofa surfing or homeless. And so actually maintaining registration with one practice is quite difficult. We tend to keep those within our service because we're not working within boundary areas. And, another barrier is individuals who actually need and want to stay under the radar. They're scared of registering because they're scared often of deportation. Barriers to accessing care. So, every practice works completely differently. Do you phone at 8 o'clock? Do you phone at 10 o'clock? The queue, you can be in a 20-person queue sometimes, can't you? Information is in English and Welsh, and that's great, but actually that's also a bit confusing for some of our service users. Sometimes we've heard of incidents where translators are not being used in practices. So people are using Google Translate or sending people away if they've not brought someone with them to translate, which obviously it is not ethical. Sometimes people have been directed to e-consult when they're actually unable to read or write, although this is less of a problem now that the COVID restrictions have passed. Fixed appointment times are difficult. As we've said, our service users often have other priorities to do with their asylum cases, and they deprioritise health. And sometimes it's just getting used to that system that we have here in the UK, a very rigid timekeeping. It's a cultural difference often. And then 10-minute appointment times, that allows little time to articulate the problem. And actually, sometimes it can take you 10 minutes to connect to a translator. So those are the barriers. Accessing care. Thanks, Holly. Barriers to delivering care. I think, all health professionals want to do a good job. No one gets up in the morning, I think, not wanting to do a good job. And actually, the 10-minute appointment time is very, very stressful for practitioners who want to do a good job. It stops us from delivering good care. I think it can put more pressure on unscheduled care services as people don't know how to navigate primary care, but then might turn up in the EU when things have got to a point that they can't handle them anymore. So late presentation of preventable conditions. I think there's no opportunity to opportunistically address problems due to time constraints. And actually, this cohort of people need that opportunistic approach with other aspects of healthcare, like vaccinations or screening, etc. I think there's services spread across the city. So actually, it's it's unusual for services to be co-located. That costs people money, which they don't have. So finance is a real barrier to that. I think sometimes colleagues have a lack of understanding of the UK asylum system and the context in which these individuals are presenting. And so it's, we've really tried to educate the GPs that work in Cavis about, doing everything we can to not make unnecessarily referrals or to try and get specialist advice that we could maybe deliver in primary care to save people unnecessary trips up to the hospital, which, as I said, cost a lot. I think sometimes barriers to delivering good care are, clinicians working frontline with these individuals. I think there's a high risk of burnout, not just with refugees and asylum seekers, but all health inclusion people, because you're often faced with these insoluble problems and no extra resource to actually deal with them. So until there is a different model of primary care for health inclusion groups, I think burnout is a risk for frontline clinicians. And then a big barrier is coding. So these groups are not coded in routine data sets very well. So actually, if they're not coded, there's minimal evidence to how they're using unscheduled secondary care to meet health needs. And therefore, you often get minimal funding when you're trying to build a case. Quick case study to finish. So this is Tekle, not his real name, but is a real case. So this young man was from Eritrea. He had very little English. He had witnessed his parents and his older brother being murdered, and he had quite nasty PTSD. He arrived in the UK with no ID, and the Home Office documented his date of birth, making him 19, but he said he was actually 16. He'd gone through an age assessment process, but he was still deemed to be 19 by the Home Office. So then that support was removed. So he was a very vulnerable young man. He had no known past medical history, never seen a health professional before. He'd been beaten by the police in Libya, and he had a chronic injury to his left arm, which meant he couldn't use it properly. And he did have a chronic oozing wound on his chest wall. So that was his past medical history. Current health problems, as I said, he had injuries to his left arm. He had this oozing lesion on his chest wall, PTSD, stress and low mood. So he completed his screening at Cavis. He had a positive IGRA test. So he had a positive TB test. No symptoms of active pulmonary TB, but likely latent TB at that point. He then completed the screening. He was referred to TB, but he didn't go to that TB appointment. He was registered with a local GP, linked in with English classes, and then just moved off into GMS world. Thank you. Thanks, Holly. So the wound on his chest wall was getting worse. He was out there in the community, registered with a GMS practice. He'd finished with Cavis. The wound on his chest wall was getting worse. It was increasing in size, becoming inflamed and oozing more. He went to see his GP, went to try and see his GP, but he was turned away by reception and advised that he had to phone to make an appointment. He didn't phone because he didn't have a phone at that point, and he got very, very anxious about speaking on the phone due to the language barrier, so he just left it. He went back a couple of weeks later as it was getting worse, explained at reception. He was then given an appointment for a week later. He then missed that appointment, but by that time was feeling very unwell, pyrexial, off food, swelling getting worse. So he went back with support from a friend, and then another appointment was made for the next day. But at that point, he felt far too ill to wait. So actually he walked into Cavis, as it was a familiar place. He walked into Cavis very, very unwell. So as I said, he's pyrexial, tachycardic, very large discharging swelling on his chest wall. Thanks, Holly. So this isn't him. This is an internet picture, but it's similar-ish. He was admitted to hospital for IV antibiotics he had a staph infection. But what else did he have? He had a tuberculous abscess as well. So his positive IGRA test, which we had referred him for, but he had DNA'd, and then he'd gone to register in GMS practices. This wasn't followed up. He then developed active systemic TB. So that's it from me. It's a whistle-stop tour of our service and a case study. And the last slide just makes the point with actually, should we be calling them hard to reach groups? Probably not. We know where they are. They're just down the road. We see them we see people in health inclusion groups every day in our communities, but it's just that our services are very hard to reach. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Isla. And sorry, I thought it was an extremely informative presentation, and I felt like I might have rushed you by, but I was really engaged. So we have a few questions for you, if that's okay. that have come in on the chat while you've been presenting. So the first one is, how is it funded? And I'm pretty sure that's in relation to the Red Cross service that you discussed. If I'm wrong, please put your hand up, Rachel, and tell me.
So yeah, British Red Cross. So we pay for that. I wrote a business case to try and get that through. I think so. Before we had British Red Cross in the department, as I said, we had people presenting in distress all the time with problems that weren't directly health problems, but very much related to health problems. And the GPs do not have the expertise to know how to deal with those. We don't have the time as well. And so it was, so it meant that we weren't seeing the people that we could actually input in with the health problems because we were overwhelmed. So I would say that the decision to commission British Red Cross from our budget has been one of the singly most successful decisions or use of money that we've done, because it has transformed our service, I think, for the clinicians, but more importantly for the service users.
Rachel's got a hand up, so I think she might would like to come in. Rachel? I'm really sorry, we can't hear you.
Is that any better?
Oh yeah,
hello.
that's fab. Yeah.
That's because my headset was in the wrong place. Thank you for that. That was really informative. And that was my question about the British Red Cross element. So you're from the Health Board, is that right? From Cardiff and the Vale.
That's it. CAVIS is a health board managed sort of primary care health inclusion service. Yeah.
Okay. I find it's really interesting because we've got a brilliant provision. I think Jackie's on the call. Our vulnerable groups nurses are fantastic in Wrexham, and I can see a lot of what they do reflected in the kind of flow chart that you were talking about there. Also, excellent working relationship with British Red Cross and other third sector partners in our area. But I think that the difference is that we don't have that funding of the British Red Cross element by the Health Board in our area. So I'm just really interested in sort of how you put that business case together and who took a lead on that. And yeah, I might drop you an email outside of the meeting if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely fine. Just to very briefly say, I think the difference with having them colleagues in the department outside is that actually we just routinely refer everybody to British Red Cross colleagues. That's part of our pathway, and then our Red Cross colleagues will then either deal with the issue in hand or they will signpost to other third sector organisations, whereas previously it was the clinicians who were then having to do the signposting, who didn't have the expertise to do that all the time, actually, to constantly keep on top of what third sector provision is out there. And so we needed somebody else to do that job. It wasn't easy. I led on trying to get British Red Cross in the department. It's not easy to do, is it? Like, money's tight everywhere. And I think it was actually just proving, well, you're paying GPs very expensive resource to try and help people with their Aspen cards, and the fact that they need new shoes, this is just really not cost effective at all. So it was more sort of making a case around that, really. But I'm very happy to link up.
Thank you.
Thank you. And there's two more. I wonder if you could give the name of the iPad translator into the chat before you leave, so that that could be shared. What iPad?
Yeah. So it's Language Line. It's set up with Language Line Solutions.
Language. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the last one is: does the nurse give albendazole?
Yeah.
Via PGD or PSD?
Right. I'm not an expert in PGDs or PSDs. I think it's PGD.
Okay, well, we
set that up about a year ago.
That one.
Yeah.
That's fab. Thank you ever so much, Isla. That was a wonderful presentation. We're really grateful for your time. I know you have to shoot off, but if there's any more, Rebecca will connect you to the person asking the question.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
And now it's over to Marina from Doctors of the World.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Marina Davidson, and I'm the Primary Care Advocacy Manager at Doctors of the World UK. I'm battling a little bit of a cold, so you'll have to bear with my voice, but hopefully we'll be able to make it through. So Doctors of the World UK is a charity. We're part of a wider international network, but in the UK we operate independently. So we have a CQC registered clinic and a national advice line, and that's to support people who are living in the UK and often have been for a number of years to access health services. So our patients include people who are undocumented, people seeking asylum, survivors of trafficking, people experiencing homelessness, and people from Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities. Often these are people who are living in an insecure housing situation, living in poverty. Our aim ultimately is to connect people to the NHS by supporting GP registration, so making sure they're registered with a GP in their local area, so it's not a parallel service to the NHS. We also refer to other services that support their health and well-being, so a bit of a kind of social assessment. And also our patients have the opportunity to see one of our volunteer clinicians as well, but the idea is that the long-term care then is with a mainstream practice. We also support GP practices directly to implement inclusive registration processes through our Safe Surgeries initiative, which is built on the evidence for barriers to GP registration from our work in our clinic. So responding to the reasons why our patients and why our caseworkers have difficulties registering. And yeah, so it's a network of GP practices aiming to remove some of the barriers to registration and reduce health inequalities. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. We also have an advocacy programme that kind of tackles the policies that exclude our patients from healthcare, and that's underpinned by our Experts by Experience group. So these are volunteers with the organisation who have lived experience of health exclusion in some way of the UK immigration system, of the asylum system. So they're involved in a lot of our decision making, in training other communities on access and entitlement to healthcare, and producing some of our resources as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just to start with a very broad introduction to why it's important for everyone to be able to access healthcare. So why is universal healthcare access important? So firstly, it's a human right. So the UK is bound to give equal access to the right to health for all persons. It's also a core principle of the NHS. So the NHS Constitution states that treatment must be based on clinical need and not ability to pay, and that it provides a comprehensive service that's available to all. It's also key for public health, so particularly thinking about primary care access, which is really important for public health in terms of prevention and early detection of disease, and also access to vaccination programmes and screening programmes that are delivered within primary care. And often if people don't have access to primary and community care and these preventative interventions, then people are more likely to turn to acute services. And also that makes it cost effective as well. So there's both a financial and human cost of delayed access to care and not having these preventative interventions, and the cost of health inequalities in the UK as well as from a health equity perspective, promoting a fairer society. So we've had a couple of these definitions already, so I won't go through them all in detail. I guess just to note that immigration status is really complex. Immigration statuses are not static, so people often move between different immigration statuses, and ultimately they're just legal terms to describe someone's temporary situation, and obviously don't define someone's identity. So these are just really the basic definitions of different immigration status, and it helps us to understand the circumstances that people are in and also how that affects their access to healthcare and health outcomes. Excuse me. So legally, people who have fled their home country and can't go back are able to apply for asylum in another country. So that's national and international law that gives certain rights and protections to people who claim asylum and refugees. Often that's quite a difficult process, and people have difficulty providing evidence to support their asylum claim. So people often leave their country with nothing. They travel for long periods of time to reach their destination. And asylum systems globally are really restricted, so that it's not easy for people to even enter a country and claim asylum, and in the UK that's true as well. Asylum applications can take months and in most cases years to decide, and while people are in that situation, it's quite uncertain. As was mentioned earlier, people are unable to work, are in accommodation that doesn't facilitate access to healthcare and is quite harmful for well-being. So if someone has their asylum claim refused, they become a refused asylum seeker if they've exhausted all of their appeal rights. That means that people are in quite a difficult situation, especially if they can't return to their home country. It might mean that they become undocumented. And people can become undocumented for a variety of reasons. So they might not know about their legal rights to claim asylum. They might have a refused asylum claim and are not being supported by the Home Office anymore. They might be survivors of trafficking. In the UK, that makes life very difficult for people without secure immigration status, because they're subject to the hostile environment measures. So they're not able to work, they're not able to rent a property there. They have restricted access to services, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment in terms of secondary care access. But everyone is still entitled to register with the GP practice. Sorry, next slide, please. Thank you. So health inequalities, which are unfair and avoidable differences in health access and outcomes and experience, arise from the social determinants of health. So that's the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age. So that includes things like education, employment, social support networks. Migration and displacement are considered social determinants of health and kind of cut across the social determinants of health, particularly thinking about poverty, housing, as we've mentioned, social networks and access to services and some of those legal barriers. It's important to remember that everyone, no matter where they are from, have unique health needs, and ultimately that's what the health service is there to respond to. So some people have more complex needs than others. But in addition to that, asylum seekers and refugees and other migrants who might be in vulnerable situations have additional factors related to socioeconomic factors that affect their health needs. So they might experience, sorry, I'm losing my voice a little bit. They might experience barriers to accessing services, as we've mentioned, and that means that they can be without medical care for extended periods of time, often with unmet health needs. They might have different access to healthcare in their country of origin and disrupted access along that journey. Obviously, that depends on the circumstances of their migration, so whether it's a forced migration or a choice, that has different health impacts. As mentioned earlier, life experiences prior to migration have substantial impacts on both physical and mental health, and circumstances in the UK, which means that even when people arrive, life doesn't get much easier. So thinking about the asylum process and long periods of uncertainty about their status. As well as some of the other things across the social determinants of health. Next slide, please. And just to give a very quick introduction to the asylum process, which again is complicated, so this is a bit of a simplification of it. But once someone arrives in the UK, they claim asylum at the port of entry or at another point in the UK. They will have a short screening interview and receive Home Office support, which is the financial support and accommodation. So the Home Office provides that while people seeking asylum are waiting for their decision. And then they are placed in various types of accommodation. So initial or contingency accommodation, which might be a hotel or a hostel, and that's been used increasingly because of the increase in people in the backlog of asylum claims waiting for a decision, and also shortage of dispersal accommodation, which is more kind of community-based accommodation. So people will remain in these types of accommodation while waiting for a decision on their claim, which can take months and years, and then they have their substantive interview, which is a more in-depth interview about their asylum claim. And even after that interview, that can be another kind of long waiting period as well. People might be moved frequently between different types of accommodation and with short notice, which can disrupt access to healthcare. And once someone has a decision on their asylum claim, whether positive or negative, they have 28 days notice to leave their Home Office accommodation. So if often that's a period of uncertainty, and it can have significant impacts on mental health. If someone has a positive decision, they have to get everything sorted in terms of housing, benefits, employment within that short period of time. So people are at risk of homelessness, exploitation, destitution as well. And similarly with people who have their claim refused, they have to leave the accommodation as well. So that becomes a very difficult situation. Next slide, please. So in terms of entitlement to healthcare, refugees and asylum seekers in the UK have the same access as anyone else, so they're fully entitled to access both primary care and secondary care for free. In Wales, that also includes refused asylum seekers as well. So immigration status and residency are not relevant to entitlement to primary care services, and as was mentioned earlier as well, proof of ID or address documents are not needed, so they're not reasonable grounds to refuse a registration. Next slide, please. So this is just to illustrate, I guess, the issue and some of the barriers to registration. So this was an article from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism in 2021 when the COVID vaccine was being rolled out. And they contacted a third of GP practices in 10 locations across the UK, and one of those was Cardiff. They asked about registering a hypothetical patient who was Rosa, a woman in her 40s without ID or proof of address. And this was during the COVID vaccine rollout, where if you didn't have an NHS number, it was quite difficult to book a vaccine through the national booking system. So registering with the GP was really important to get that NHS number for people that were registering for the first time. So 62% of the practices in the survey said that they wouldn't register the patient, and 14% were unsure. So only a small proportion of the practices that were included in the survey would register someone without proof of ID, address or legal immigration status. So just showing how kind of widespread this issue is in terms of difficulties for registration before people can access the the wider health system. I think this has been covered already, so I'll just go through this very quickly, but some of the main barriers to accessing healthcare: lack of ID or proof of address, as we've spoken about; accessibility, so language, digital, so people might not have a mobile phone, might not have access to the internet to access health information online or register with the GP or interact with NHS services. People new to the UK might not know what their entitlements are or how to navigate services, so what services for what. Immigration status checks sometimes happen in primary care and in secondary care, and that's intimidating for patients without secure immigration status. So it might mean that people disengage with services entirely. They might be worried about their information being shared with the Home Office and any consequences for their immigration status, and we'll touch on that later in terms of secondary care and charging. There's also fear and experience of judgment and prejudice, and lack of funds for transport to attend appointments. So people living on £8 a week might not be able to afford a bus fare to get to an appointment. Next slide, please. Just to think about the wider circumstances in which people might not have access to proof of ID or address, something with their name and address on it and a photo ID is actually quite difficult for a range of reasons. So people with insecure immigration status who might not have a passport, they might have had to submit their documents to the Home Office, or if they're undocumented, again, very unlikely to have something with their name and address on it. And similar for people who have no fixed address, so people who are street homeless or sofa surfing. Also people fleeing domestic abuse who might be staying with friends, family or in a shelter, young people leaving care, and people living on a boat. So lots of different reasons why people might not have proof of ID or address, and that obviously shouldn't prevent them from accessing primary care services. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of an intro into our Safe Surgeries initiative. So we have over 2,000 practices that are signed up across the UK, and the aim really is to build an expert community against health exclusion. So it's a network of GP practices demonstrating adherence to NHS guidance and the contract ultimately, and making that commitment to remove some of the barriers to primary care faced by underserved communities. So it was launched in 2018, so it's been a few years now, and aiming to provide primary care with resources, training and support to be able to easily implement changes in registration policies that improve access for vulnerable groups. Next slide, please. I don't know if this video will work, but let's go for it. Okay, that was a nice little rest of my voice. So the Safe Surgeries Toolkit outlines 7 steps for safe registration. So basically the minimum requirements of any practice to align with the NHS guidance. So that's not insisting on proof of ID and address documents, never asking to see a visa or proof of immigration status, which isn't needed for primary care. Making sure that patients know that their personal information is safe, so won't be shared with the Home Office, for example. Using interpreters if needed, both at reception and at consultation, and making sure that the use of professional interpreters is promoted to patients, and double appointments allocated as well, double time for appointments. So never using friends, family members, and never children to interpret. Displaying posters in the practice to reassure patients of their right to register and that the surgery is a safe space. So this one is an example of one of the Safe Surgeries posters, which is translated in different languages. So don't have documents, don't worry. We might ask for proof of ID or address, but if you don't have any and you live in our practice area, you can still register with us, which is really reassuring for patients to see when they go into the practice. And then empowering frontline staff with training and inclusive registration policy. So making sure that that change is sustainable and across the practice. Next slide, please. We also have a range of translated resources, so supporting patients know how the NHS works. So this one is a leaflet for migrants and refugees, so talking about the wider services that are available and how to register with a GP. Available at the link there at the bottom. Next slide, please. And then there's also a variety of kind of self-advocacy cards for patients to take with them when they access services. So if they have any issues with registration, there's further support on those as well. Next slide, please. And then just to finish, a very quick introduction into secondary care charging. So there are some restrictions on access to secondary care services depending on immigration status and depending on whether someone is ordinarily resident in the UK or not. So that's mainly people with no formal immigration status. So that means that for some services they have to pay up front. But it's a very complicated system. There are some exempt services and some exempt groups of people. So people seeking asylum and refugees are exempt from secondary care and obviously primary care services as well. And some services such as A&E, treatment for sexual domestic violence or torture, are exempt. The charges are 150% of the NHS tariff, so that means that an average maternity bill is between £7,000 and £14,000. So obviously that's a huge barrier to care for people who are often undocumented and don't really have the means to pay those bills because they're unable to work. And services are withheld generally unless the treatment is considered urgent or immediately necessary. So that means that it must be provided regardless of ability to pay. So that's a fairly basic overview of quite a complex system. The main guidance, I guess, within primary care is that GP practices must always refer patients regardless of immigration status and regardless of whether they are chargeable. So ultimately, it's the responsibility of secondary care to identify and assess eligibility for people who might be chargeable. So yeah, obviously charging is a huge barrier to healthcare for people with insecure immigration status. It means that some people avoid services entirely, so the exemptions actually don't end up working because people don't register with a GP. They don't engage with services because they think that they might be chargeable. There's also the risk that debts in secondary care are reported to the Home Office, and this does affect future immigration applications. So people's right to settlement in the UK is affected if they have an NHS debt. And also because it's such a complex system, there is confusion about the rules and poor practice. So people who are exempt can be billed by mistake, and some treatment is delayed or denied when it shouldn't be. So that's just a very quick introduction into that, and I think that is me done. Oh, so as well as our primary care clinic, we also have a hospital access project, so supporting people who have been denied access to secondary care for various reasons and providing advice. So just details on that there. And then just a couple of links. So all of the resources I mentioned related to safe surgeries are available on our website. The translated information hub, so different leaflets on navigating the NHS and other health topics are available there, and details on our services as well, and my email address if there's any questions that come up later on. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Marina, and you've done so well with your bad voice.
Survived to the end.
You survived. I just want to check you're staying for the next presentation, so if there's any questions, you can have them at the end. Is that okay?
Yeah, no problem.
Perfect. Okay, well, we'll head straight over to Maria from Swansea Bay Health Board. I believe Maria might be keeping her camera off just due to her location, but she can let us know.
Correct.
That's correct.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I'm Maria Doyle. I'm the lead nurse for the health access team for asylum seekers in Swansea Bay Health Board. That covers Swansea and Neathport Talbot areas. Next slide, please. So our service is aimed at asylum seekers as asylum seekers who are living in ready homes accommodation. So they are in Swansea Bay area. Those are houses for single sexes, men and women, or family houses. There's no asylum seekers in Swansea Bay in hotels. There's approximately 212 properties in Swansea, and the numbers of people moving through those properties, it varies between 800 to 1,000 people. It's dependent on how quickly they move through those properties, will depend on where they're at in their asylum application, what stage they're at in that. So but there is a fairly constant move through the properties. Neathport Talbot has far fewer properties, but there are some mainly families placed in Neathport Talbot area. We also see unaccompanied asylum seeker children, that's 16 and 17-year-olds. We see them in collaboration with the looked after children's team. They take a lead on the care of these children, but we support them with offering TB screening and vaccinations. And currently there's 17 properties in Swansea and 7 in Neathport Talbot, housing these young people sort of either with support workers or with or semi-independent. So we're a nurse-led service. We work Monday to Friday. As myself, the band 7, and then the rest of the team are all part-time. Thank you. Next slide. How our service works is through the Ready Homes portal, housing portal. We get notified of the new arrivals into Swansea Bay area. And we will then We also get informed separately from the Looked After Children's team about new placements in Swansea Bay. Once we have those notifications, we will then collaborate with primary care GP registration teams, and we'll arrange GP allocation for the service users. Once we've got that, next slide, please. Once we've got that, we'll then offer all the new arrivals an initial health assessment. And we're covering our health assessments the same as has been mentioned before, really. You know, we're covering the main areas of health to just assess what their current health needs are. As part of that, we request previous health information from previous GPs, if they're or previous inclusion teams, and we'll use that along with our conversations with the individuals to determine what are their current health needs when they've arrived in our area. We offer vaccinations, and as I said, we offer TB skin testing, a latent TB skin test, a MAN2 test. I've just noticed an error on my slide. We actually offer it for a TB instance of 40 per 100,000 in the population. But basically, we offer it to everybody who comes through the door, because everybody fits into that category. Thank you. Next slide. So after we've done our initial health assessments, then we will offer referrals to individuals. We work closely with the sexual health outreach team and with mental health services. One of the third sector organisations provides trauma informed approach to counselling service. It's actually a pathway of the NHS in Swansea Bay. So they can be referred by a GP into that, but we will do that in advance, so just to expedite that referral if necessary. We'll also support referral to 111 for urgent dental care. There is, I'm sure, as in most areas, all areas, I would imagine, there is a huge problem with accessing dental care. Currently in Swansea, we only have one dental surgery that is taking direct referrals from us for asylum seekers to have dental care, and there's very few appointments. The number of appointments that are offered, it doesn't meet the need. The dental surgery provides an excellent service, but we need more dental surgeries to be involved, really. We'll also support getting a first GP appointment if it's felt necessary, and we'll link with other services such as midwifery and health visiting and child health and secondary care as well. And we, as part of our normal processes, we're always trying to identify any safeguarding risks. Next slide, please. So we do joint partnership working with their housing provider, their housing managers for ready homes. That might be on sharing safeguarding concerns, or it might be on a service user might have said to their housing manager, I can't access my GP, I can't get an appointment. They'll contact us and say, can you advocate for this person, which we will do. We work closely with the local authority leads, obviously within Swansea Bay services. We have pre and post-reg students from Swansea University come to us, but our primary partnership working is with the third sector. Next slide, please. And these are our key partners. The top left-hand corner there, that's East. East is our main partner, followed closely by SCVS and the African Community Centre. But all of these organisations, they're all located quite closely together. We all talk regularly. Everybody knows what services are offered. Us as healthcare workers, we can't keep up with what's being offered, but we have confidence that we make our everybody gets referral to these organisations and by us, and we have confidence that they will work with the new arrival to determine what support they need. Things they provide might be something as simple as access to the food banks. It might be activities such as accessing a gym or getting a bicycle. It might be access to English language lessons. There might be groups for women, groups for men. There's a huge range of activities that they provide, and we have an excellent working relationship with them. Next slide, thank you. Thank you, that's it from me.
Oh, thank you, Maria. That was lovely. Thank you. Really informative presentation about your service. So I will just open it up to the floor. Is there any questions from anybody? If you want to pop your hand up, and I'll just check the chat. There was a question about how many practices in Wales have signed up to Safe Surgeries, Marina. I think that was in there.
Off the top of my head, I would say around 10, between 10 and 20, something like that, across the whole of Wales.
Okay, fab. And Fatima's popped in the chat that we're doing a joint bit of work around what we can do in Wales and around the model of safe surgeries and the inclusion health group. So that's underway. Is there any questions? If there isn't, I've got one for both of you, and it is. Oh no, lovely. Tess, would you like to come in?
Hi, just a really quick one. So I'm Tess Rayford, I'm cluster lead for Cardiff South West and Cardiff East. Just thinking that in terms of the safe surgeries, that going via the clusters might be a good way to get in. So a lot of clusters are kind of, you know, doing dementia friendly stuff, or, you know, get kind of like, you know, and park run and getting the whole cluster involved. So that might be a really good way of kind of onboarding quite a lot of practices in one go. So I'd be really interested in linking in, you know, about that.
Lovely. We'll take any suggestion and any way of getting this off the ground. So that's fab, Tess. I've got. I can see that you commented as well as no different person. Sorry. I've got your. We've got your email, so I'll make sure that we connect with you. Rebecca will take that down. So that's lovely. Thank you. Yeah. So I was just going to ask if Marina and Maria, that if you could both provide your sort of top tips for primary care on what to do to you know, engage this population group and make things a bit easier for them, considering all the things we've heard today. Marina, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So I think number one is making sure that there's inclusive registration processes in the practice, and that the reception desk, you know, the first place where a patient will go is a welcoming environment, and people feel, you know, that they can trust it, and yeah, that's obviously the first point into their wider healthcare access as well. So that's really important. The second thing, I guess, is around processes for booking interpreters, so making sure that's pre-booked automatically for patients, especially those who don't know their right to have an interpreter. So that's really promoted across their healthcare access. Also available at reception, and support for registration when needed, and I guess supplemented by translated resources on kind of navigating NHS services and entitlement. And then a third one would be advocating for these patients wherever possible, providing additional support. So being aware of local support organisations in your area, referring to social prescribers, and yeah, that's it, I guess. Thinking about the kind of social determinants of health and how else the primary care can support with that as well.
That's lovely. Thank you. Maria?
Yeah, mine are, of course, very similar. It's there to advocate for the use of language line, and also to bear in mind the literacy levels of individuals, even in their own language. They may well struggle. and the cost implications for travel in accessing service. You know, something we see is somebody might visit a GP and they're told, yes, they need a blood test, but actually accessing the phlebotomy clinic nearest to them, that might require 2 bus journeys. So it might be just down the road and they can walk to it, but it's just thinking about those things. And the third one is building community links with the third sector organisations. That's really, really important, you know, because that feedback, but both between service users and the third sector and their NHS, it's really worthwhile.
Brilliant, thank you. Someone's at Core, or Bridget Core, would you like to come in?
Yeah, hi, thank you. Yeah, my name's Bid. I'm the Asylum Lead at the Wales Strategic Migration Partnership. Thank you for today. It's been really informative, really great speakers. Just a question, it's really good to hear all this best practice, but what is the advice when it doesn't quite go to plan? We've all heard lots of stories around practice falling way below where we'd want it to be. So in terms of people themselves at the surgeries or whatever, wherever they're presenting, but for us as partners, what can we do to try to raise this, to try to make a difference? Don't know who that question's to, sorry.
Marina, would you like to come in, or I can ask Kerry?
I don't know whether that one's for me. Yeah, I don't think so.
Kerry, I think is on the call.
Yeah, sorry, I was just coming off mute. I don't have a solution for that either, though, I'm afraid, but it's a good thing to add to our our burning issues to answer that question. So thank you. And I think maybe we could meet with you separately as well to think how we work better together. If Vicky, you could follow up on that, that would be great. Somebody in the team. Thank you. Yeah.
That's lovely. Thank you for we can't answer it, but it's something to work on, so good to flag. There's just a comment from Asma. Registration for GP could become more problematic to prove ID with online e-visa, which everyone is switched to now. I don't know, Marina, if there's an answer, if that's something that doctors of the world have considered.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it causes a lot of difficulties for people for various reasons, and I think it's going to become a massive issue because of like digital exclusion. People might not be able to prove their immigration status for accessing a variety of services. So I think, yeah, there's already been a lot of kind of media about the difficulties that the transition to the digital services cause. So yeah, I think that will really impact people, and yeah, even more reason for practices to kind of not be enforcing these policies related to ID.
Lovely. Rachel has said, for me, something that stands out is the great examples of good practice in certain areas, highlighting the different experiences, service provision in different locations. This is I think it's about saying that we need to share these because of the widening areas of dispersal. Is that right, Rachel?
Hi there. Yeah, I'm basically saying some great examples of good practice, but what that does is just highlight that actually in other areas now where widening dispersal has happened, there perhaps isn't that same structure and infrastructure in place, and it's how can we collectively, but you know, particularly the health boards, how can we make sure that there is that. It's not a postcode lottery, you know, you get that consistent level of high quality service wherever you go in Wales.
Yeah, and I think that's a really valid point, and you know, hopefully the widening awareness and the work going on in around inclusion health should hopefully help that and help to make it more of a general approach taken across. So thank you. Beth?
My point, excuse me, my point was actually very similar to Rachel's and asking about that kind of broader widening out of awareness beyond kind of primary healthcare into secondary. Certainly we've experienced some challenges of people being discharged from hospital to our office and things like that. So yeah, it would be great if there was ambition and ability to kind of spread that awareness more widely.
Certainly something that we can note down as like the wider work, as Kerry said. Yeah. Thank you. Right, well, if there's no more questions, no more hands have gone up, it's just for me to thank everybody who's attended today, and thank you to all the wonderful speakers for sharing their slides and their knowledge. It's been a really great session. And to say thank you very much, just to let you know that the next so the next session will be on sex workers, and that's towards the end of February. So that's the next Inclusion Health webinar that we're putting on. Rebecca's going to share that in the link with you so you can register for that one. I think it's the 28th of February, but I can't be quoted on that. And also there's going to be a link to an evaluation form as well popped in the chat. So I really appreciate any feedback you have on the webinars, if you've attended them, what you thought, anything that we can improve on, that would be wonderful to hear about. And just to say thank you ever so much, and yeah, please get in contact if there's anything around this work or the wider work we're doing. And yeah, thank you everybody. Have a lovely weekend and afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.